Hello and welcome to Thursday's interview here on Viking.TV in Arctic Circle Week. My old boss in television some 35 years ago told me something that's probably lived with me for the rest of my life and has caused me to do some pretty silly things occasionally, but also take up some fantastic opportunities. I tell you what, though, it is the recipe for an interesting life. His mantra, which he passed on to me, was never turn down an adventure. He reasoned that many of us complain of being bored or suffering bad luck, but he said what you often don't realise is that opportunities, exciting projects and interesting people actually do come into your life, but you just don't see them, or they frankly are just a little too timid to jump at them. Well, my guest today has certainly lived by the same sort of mantra, and it has led her to do things she might only have dreamed of once upon a time. For instance, if someone ever offered you the opportunity to cross-country ski to the North Pole, would you see that as laughable and turn it down, or tempting and volunteer yourself to have a go? Even despite my old boss's mantra, that's one I would have laughed at. Not for me. I can barely imagine how hard skiing to the North Pole could be. Well, this is how it was for my guest today. A long, hard slog in almost unbearable conditions. Have a look at this. So what made the idea of that sound attractive? Well, let's ask my guest today, the first British woman to ever ski to the magnetic North Pole. And there she is to prove it. Well, let's welcome her now. Welcome, Sue Stockdale. Hello.
Hi, Anne. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to see you in warmer conditions.
Absolutely. Who wants to be back in the Arctic?
Well, yes. Well, what made you want to go in the first place?
Well, I've got an insatiable curiosity, and it's a bit like your mantra of your old boss. I just love adventure. And that was really sparked by reading Enid Blyton's famous 5 and Secret 7 adventures when I was a young girl. And it always seemed to me that she could turn an ordinary day out with friends and a dog into an amazing adventure in words. I wanted to recreate that in real life. That's why I've always been looking for adventures ever since.
Do you come from an adventurous family?
No, we don't. We used to go for picnics locally in Edinburgh, and I was in the Brownie Guides when I was a youngster, and we used to do adventurous things there. In fact, I was camping when I was 8 years old with my other brownies on an adventure. So maybe I didn't think of it as being adventurous, and perhaps that's where it began as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is when you're that little. But you were pretty good at athletics, weren't you? Did you represent Scotland?
Yes, and that was really inspired by our physical education teacher was Margot Wells. Her husband was Alan Wells, and he won the Olympic 100 metres gold medal in 1980, and he brought it along to the school. And, you know, there's nothing like seeing a gold medal from the Olympics up close to inspire you. And I just wanted to run and improve my running. And that curiosity about what was possible drove me to keep improving what I was doing. And ultimately, I was able to represent Scotland, which I was really honoured to do.
Fantastic. I quite agree with you. I mean, here we are in the world at the moment with people coming back from the Olympics with those medals. And when you hear about them, when you see them on your news, but certainly, as you said, when you hold them in your hand and look at somebody else's medal, it's incredible how inspirational it is. And doesn't that just show how important maybe the Olympics was just in the last few weeks?
Oh, absolutely. I think it gives everyone a bit of a pick-me-up, no matter which country you're in the world.
Now, your first real adventure then was to Kenya. And that was something you volunteered for. Lovely picture of you there. What was it all about?
Well, this was part of an Operation Rally expedition, as it was known then. It's now Rally International. It's a charity that take young people aged between 17 and 24 to a remote part of the world. And we were carrying out scientific, community and adventure projects. I got 3 months off work with my salary paid to go and participate on that expedition. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to find out about another country, see the wild animals that are in Kenya, and actually maybe make a difference to the lives of those living in that country. We were building schools, we were renovating buildings, living and working with the locals, and then doing treks like you see there with the camels. So it was a brilliant experience. And I was with young people from all around the world. There was 120 of us. So when I was 22 years old, I had a global network of friends at the end of it. It was just amazing.
That's quite something, isn't it? Is that the first time you'd sort of been seriously abroad?
No, I had been to, well, yes, I'd been to the typical Spanish holiday in one's late teens. But other than that, it was the first time I had to buy a rucksack and a pair of walking boots for that particular expedition, and put a few more stamps in my passport.
Yeah, and that's exciting in itself. So let's go back to the North Pole, because again, you volunteered for that. It was actually an advertisement, wasn't it?
Yes, I saw it in the newspaper, and it said wanted 10 novice Arctic explorers to ski around 350 miles or 550 kilometers, something like that. And I just wondered when I saw the advert, oh, I bet that's going to be freezing cold. Maybe it's like staying in your freezer. I wonder what that's like for a month, because I imagine it'll be taking that length of time. And then I sent off for the application to get more details. And when it came back, it said on the brochure, are you man enough for the ultimate challenge? And it was all pictures of men. Now, talk about a gold medal for inspiration. that gave me some motivation to want to participate in this expedition, and perhaps to show that maybe women could get in the team as well, and we could be successful too.
Yeah, it's appalling when you think of it now, isn't it? But they just said, are you man enough? But the other thing is that, yes, they'd asked for novice explorers, but that you needed to ski, and that you'd never been anywhere quite so cold in your life. So, I mean, how did you even know you'd be able to do it?
Well, I didn't. But I believe that, I think that's the thing about any of our experiences, is sometimes I think we compartmentalize our experience in life, and we think that we can't translate one situation into another. So I knew I could cope with extreme situations, not cold ones, but hot ones in Kenya. I knew I could camp out of doors. I knew I could work in a team. I knew I was fit because I'd represented my country in sport. So I thought, well, I'm taking all of these skills and just taking them into a different place. This environment happens to be cold. I don't normally feel the cold. So what's not possible about that? If I can get in the team, I can perhaps prove myself to be able to do it. And I think it's just not allowing that voice that we all have in our heads sometimes to say, oh, no, you couldn't possibly do that. I just say, well, why not? Let's give it a go. And it's taking that possibility and turning it into action, and taking the first step that gets you going with the momentum to see what's possible. I
think that just shows, just the way you describe it there, it shows the difference in mind, in the way your mind looks at these things. Some people would just say, no, I know I can't do that, or I'd never be able to learn how. Why would I do it? And you say, why not to yourself? Maybe you always have. So you were picked from well over 500 applicants to be part of that trip, and it was being led by a very special leader whose name we all know now.
David Hempelman Adams. He was very successful. He's done a lot of expeditions to polar regions and with hot air balloons as well. I found him really inspirational, Anne, because he didn't just go to the head of the line of us and say, right, I'm the leader, follow me and ski to the North Pole. He recognized that we all had skills and capabilities, and it was about his ability as a leader to draw them out of us. Yes, making sure we kept safe. Yes, sharing important details of knowledge with us, but also allowing us to chip in with ideas, to feel that we were part of the team and contributing. And I think that's a great example of a fantastic role model for a leader. So I learned a lot from David.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about leadership a bit later, because that's what you do now too. But that expedition, what was it? What was its focus? What did you have to learn, and what were you ultimately needing to do?
Well, primarily it was an adventure expedition. There'd never been a team of novices to embark on a polar expedition before. This is the mid-90s. The only time that really novices were taking part in expeditions was the beginning of the round the world yacht race. So people were sailing and novices were doing sailing, but they were not doing polar expeditions. So this was really an unknown at that time. So primarily an adventure, but secondarily, we also had some scientific equipment with us from the University of Ottawa. So we were tracking the location of the magnetic North Pole, because it's rare. These days satellite is used, but in those days they need humans to go out there and actually use theodolites and magnetometers to measure where the magnetic North Pole is. So we were collecting that data for the university so they could accurately pinpoint at that time where the magnetic North Pole was.
Before we talk about what is the magnetic North Pole, because even that's a question I've got to ask, we've got to remember that you'd never done cross-country skiing before, and you'd had to learn that as well. How difficult was it? Because it always looks to me really hard work. I mean, downhill skiing is one thing, but cross-country skiing is nothing but hard slog.
You're right.
And it is incredibly good stomach muscles.
Well, I think it's easy to do the movement, but what's not easy, I found, is to do it efficiently and to burn minimal energy. And we had a Swedish woman in our team as well. There was only 2 of us that were women, and all the rest were men. She became the first Swedish woman to get there. Of course, she was, the benchmark for cross-country skiing capabilities. I watched her ski with ease and grace and really struggled to follow her. So I was probably burning a lot more calories just to keep moving than she was. And I did find that by the end of 30 days, I had improved significantly and found it a whole lot easier.
Yes, I bet those core muscles had developed, because you really need a strong core, don't you? How many calories did you have to consume just to keep yourself going?
We were eating 5,000 calories a day.
Wow. Okay, and probably burning up every single one of them as well.
Yes.
Let me ask about the magnetic North Pole then, because what's the difference between the North Pole and the magnetic North Pole?
Well, in simple terms, the magnetic North Pole is where your compass points to, and it's the point where all the Earth's magnetic forces come in vertically into the world. So you can see on the diagram there. Now, when we were going there, it was in the northwest of Canada, and it moves about, in those days it was moving about 15 kilometers a year in a northwesterly direction. It's actually begun to move much faster than that. These days it's moving 30 to 40 kilometers per day in terms of distance. And now if you go to the magnetic North Pole, you won't find it in Canada. Actually, it's in Russia. Yeah. In 2017, it headed past the geographical North Pole, which is what we all know as the top of the world, and it's now heading down towards Siberia. So it's a really interesting.
Yeah. Why? Because it's moving. Move.
Because of the Earth's magnetic fields and the ever-changing. I'm not a scientist, Anne, so I can't describe it very accurately, but I understand it's to do with the Earth's magnetic forces, which are actually gradually changing.
So when you hear about expeditions to the North Pole, it really is worth asking which one they mean, because the geographic North Pole tends to be just where we think of as being the top of the world, as you say.
Yes, and I have been there as well. I went there several years later from the Russian side of the Arctic.
Absolutely. We've got some lovely pictures here now. I think the first ones are of you in that expedition to the magnetic North Pole.
That's right, it is, yes. Looking cold and having to work hard dragging those heavy sledges.
How heavy are the sledges?
They're about the weight of an average person, so about 60 to 70 kilograms. Of course, you have everything in there that you need to survive. Food, fuel, safety equipment. No spare clothing unless, really just the essentials. So I did end up wearing pretty much the same clothes for an entire month.
But let's not worry about that. It's what you're achieving. Yes, there are lots of pictures of you at that magnetic North Pole. Also, the geographic is. Now, which one's that?
That's the magnetic North Pole. You can see there's a little bit of colour in the background. That means we're on a land mass, and that was in northwest Canada when the pole was there. The geographic North Pole, the top of the world, is frozen Arctic Ocean. That's at the geographical North Pole. So there's no land underneath us there, just the Arctic Ocean that's frozen.
I see. Okay. And I think we've got another one of the team there as well. Yeah. Yes. It must feel incredible when you get there. How do you know you've got there?
You're following your GPS. It's really based on that, because if you tried to use a compass would try to swiddle around and point straight downwards. So it's effectively useless. Therefore, you have to rely on technology. But of course, any technology being used in those freezing cold temperatures, the batteries are going to be used up really quickly. So you can't have it switched on all the time. So you have to then, when we were skiing, we'd switch it on at the start of the day, set our direction, hopefully follow a point on land in the distance, work towards that, and then switch it on sporadically a couple of times later in the day. Very often, if it was foggy, we ended up going the wrong direction.
Ooh, no. But it must be, that must add to the excitement in a way. If you've got a traditional compass and it's beginning to go a bit mad, you know that you're nearly there in a way, because that's the right thing for it to be doing. Apart from, and as you said there, there's a difference in the landscape there between the frozen sea of the geographic North Pole.
Yep.
And the landmass that may be behind you in Canada, or as you say now in Russia, for the magnetic. What do you ever get a chance to actually sort of stand back and look at the incredible landscapes around there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Particularly at the end of the day. Normally during the day when you're skiing, you really just want to keep moving. If you stand for any length of time, you're likely to get frostbite. It's so cold, -20, -40 degrees Celsius. So the only real opportunity you have to take a breath and admire the landscape is often when the tent's up at the end of the day and you're about to climb in it, and you know that if you get a little bit of cold, you will have some respite in your warm tent later.
Or I suppose at the beginning or the end of an expedition, when you are just sort of, you've landed in the country. We've got some beautiful footage now of just how gorgeous the landscape can be. But I guess it's much more at the beginning of the journey. If you look at this now, yeah, I mean, it looks like the most incredible landscape. But there's also, you know, fauna and flora. Look at the beautiful. Do you ever get a chance to see any of that sort of thing?
Not in the time of year we were there. We were there in April and May. It's just winter turning into spring. So unfortunately, the earth hasn't woken up to be warm enough for those wonderful plants to appear.
And why then do you go at that time of year?
You need to be able to cope with where the temperatures, if it's too warm in the summer, like you can see on the video, well, there would be nothing to ski on in certain places these days because all of that frozen ice begins to melt. If you go in the winter, it's just too cold completely, and there's often 24-hour darkness. So you have to have the change of the seasons, and springtime is really an optimum time for any expedition to go out to the Arctic.
You have to pick your moment, don't you? But it just shows how the landscape can change from, I mean, maybe the landscape there that we're seeing was covered in snow and ice at one point. And then, as you say, the land wakes up for a while, and there is still that incredible beauty underneath all the frozen ice. So where else? You've been to Chile, I think, which again has its own incredible landscape, the Arctic and the Antarctic. And you've begun more and more to not only face the dangers yourself, but to take on the responsibility of others by leading these expeditions.
Yes.
Isn't it? That's Chile there.
That's Chile, yes. It's quite a different perspective, and I really love it to be able to enable others to experience the wonder of being on an expedition, learning about themselves and their capabilities, and for them, just like I did at the end of my first ever expedition, come back home and realize, wow, I'm capable of far more than I ever imagined was possible. To see that in the faces of other youngsters is just so satisfying for me.
I suppose you've got to enable them, haven't you? But at the same time, you've got to have the knowledge and almost more energy than them, just in case you were needed.
Yes, I think it's about having innate belief in others, that in their potential. And I think that can, people feel that if you are leading a group and they feel that you believe in them and you believe in their capabilities, and that they trust that you will step in and guide them where necessary, you will make sure that they can be as safe as they can be, then it instills confidence both ways. And really that's, I think, what's so important about leadership, is to inspire as well as motivate. And I think those two things are subtly different. Are
there any, I mean, there must have been many times when you're sort of snuggled up, that makes it sound cozy, inside a tent, having faced a really hard day and trying to motivate others through what's obviously going to be a hard night, and feeling really quite rough yourself, but still needing to talk them through the next day. I mean, have you ever had to talk anyone out of going back or giving up?
I've had to, yeah, I've had to maybe not talk them out of giving up. In our Antarctica expedition, we had some young people who'd never seen snow before. We had the first Vietnamese person to ever go to Antarctica. And you can imagine that, you know, her eyes were like saucers. There were, she was so amazed by this wonder of the world, and completely thinking about it in a way that it's not as actually dangerous as it really is. And therefore going out, for example, not wearing any gloves. Now, of course, one can do that in relatively warm conditions. You don't realise how quickly frostbite can take hold in these extreme conditions. So one of the things I learned from David Hempelman-Adams and pass on now to others is to treat yourself like a baby, to just take so much care of yourself, to look after yourself at every moment, that then you will not allow any of those things like frostbite to begin to happen. And I think it's particularly in a team setting, we also, from David, were told to buddy up with somebody else. Sometimes you can't see the frostbite on your own face, you can't feel it, but somebody else can see it. So a little bit like diving, having a buddy to look out for you is just one of those things that's really important when you're in a team and you're in an unfamiliar environment.
Or if you're starting to talk a bit strangely, or you're not thinking as quickly as you normally do, you might not notice it. But others around you would and should point it out. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about trusting each other.
Yeah. And so even a leader has to have a buddy?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, everybody has to look after their health. So David had a buddy just as much as I did or anybody else on our North Pole expedition. Really important thing to think about.
And I imagine, and again, it's through your training, having done it many, many times, there's almost a list of rules in your head. You don't do that, you can't do that. Just as you were saying, as children, we look upon snow falling from the sky as pretty and lovely, and but we don't know yet the rules that actually it's a hostile environment too, and it's trying to kill you.
Well, one of the things in packing your sledge in the Arctic is always putting things in exactly the same place every time you pack your sledge. So where are your warm spare clothes? Where is the food? Where's your safety equipment? And just having that routine enables you to automatically know where anything is at any given moment. Because when you're absolutely tired and exhausted, the mental effort that might be required to think, now where are those gloves or where is that food? You don't need to expend your energy on decisions like that. So I think sometimes I drive my husband mad because I adopt the same principle at home, just making sure with some of those simple things that we have them in exactly the same place every single time.
No, but actually it really does make sense, doesn't it? I think we all know that. We've had to learn that one just doing the housework. You have, though, had moments where you've had to go through severe storms. Wasn't there a time when you were all packed into a tent for days, or what seemed like days? I think it was over 36 hours with very little food or water.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And that was in the Greenland, skiing across the Greenland ice cap. There were 4 of us. We were at the highest point, 8,000 feet. We encountered a really dreadful storm. That's probably been the closest in any situation I've ever felt that I was going to die, because there was just no air to breathe outside at all. The wind was whipping up the ice crystals and it was just so dangerous. So the 4 of us went into one tent and we did spend 36 hours. Now, of course, you have got food, but if you eat that food, that's your ration and you still have to continue on your expedition. So you really want to limit what you eat and, of course, drink as well. It's just a case of survival minute to minute. And you can see that picture there. We don't look that happy when we're eating our rations there.
And it's very weather beaten, or is that sort of, is that ice?
It's windburn. That's the effect of the sun and the wind on my face. Yeah. It's quite a time. And I think it does, I began to think about, I always love eating and food. So I was thinking about, well, what will we get to eat next when we get through this challenge? One of the other team was thinking about practicalities. How will our tent survive? Another one kind of almost went into denial and she put her headphones on and listened to music. So each person had their own way of surviving that tough situation. But yet we knew we were all there for one another and we would try and make sure we all stayed safe.
What's that one? Bearing east, we are strong.
That was our mantra for that Greenland expedition. And that's a piece of wooden board. And that was actually our cooking board. So once we pitched the tent, inside the tent, we put the board onto the snow, and then we put our stove on top of that, and it stops the heat from your stove melting the ice beneath it.
Do you think pitting yourself against the elements and throwing yourself into dangerous situations sometimes, or at least potentially dangerous ones, and testing your own mettle, do you think that's good for your character?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that's how our species have survived over time. Failure to change and failure to explore for, different species as well as us as human beings is what will cause us to die out ultimately. I think the whole way the world is adapting, we as human beings have to be adaptable. And that's just the principle I take every single day. I have something different for breakfast every morning. Now, for some, they might think, oh, goodness, what a bore. For me, I wake up and it reminds me that we shouldn't get too comfortable and that we should always be prepared to adapt and change. It's just a little thing, but it really helps me to be reminded of that.
But some of us like to be comfortable. Some people do.
And don't get me wrong, I like comfort too. And I also like to feel confident that when the unexpected arises, which we've all had to experience in the last 12 months, we'll be able to cope. Yes. So it's practicing getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, as well as enjoying the comforts too.
It's just pushing yourself just that little bit, isn't it? You've obviously always given yourself quite a big push. Maybe a little push is good for everybody. The Queen recognised your amazingness by giving you an award called Pioneer to the Nation. That must have been quite an extraordinary moment.
Yes, well, it's nice to be recognised for something that I'm doing that I'm really enjoying. And there were many other people there as well who were pioneers in different ways. So, it's nice to be recognised for one's accomplishments, certainly from somebody like Her Majesty the Queen.
Oh, absolutely, a magic moment, worth all of that trudging through the snow. But amazingly, you just so love a challenge that there's a programme in this country on British television, Channel 4, called Superhuman, which again invited for some applicants, and of course you were one of them, and you got onto the show to do some extraordinary things, again just to test whether or not you could do them. What sort of things did you have to do?
Oh, there was a whole variety of things. One test was called fearlessness. We had to climb to a gantry 150 feet off the ground. You were roped, your ankles were roped up, so you were prepared potentially to do a bungee jump. Mm-hmm. And then you had to keep your heart rate as low as possible, and you were competing against somebody else who was also standing on the gantry. And the person who used up their heart rates, whose beating the fastest, their, if you like, the cord behind that was holding them to the gantry behind their waist was cut, and they had to do the bungee jump. So all of the time, the idea is about how can you keep your breathing as calm as possible and not feel frightened and fearful in that pretty unexpected and uncertain situation.
And do you have a technique for that?
Well, I didn't realise that I did have until I found myself in that situation. And I remembered it from the world of sport. I use a technique called visualisation. And it's just creating a kind of mental image in your mind when you're about to compete in a race that enables you to keep calm, relaxed, and visualise you being successful in the race. So I thought, well, if I can do it in a race, maybe I can do it on this gantry. And I was up against a firefighter. He's well used to heights. And he was asked, did he have a strategy? He shrugged his shoulders and said, no, I'm confident. I do this all the time. And I said, well, I have this strategy. All the camera crew were putting bets on who would win. And of course, they all bet on the firefighter, not me, apart from the scientist who devised the test. And eventually then I won, which I was delighted about.
Oh, my goodness. Isn't it interesting, though, that the scientist who devised the test sort of knew the way to success, knew the trick? Yes. Mm. And sleep deprivation you had to go through, and a simulated helicopter crash, and you still put yourself through it. When I say you push yourself, do you actually enjoy that, or is it something you just have to do?
I enjoy it. It's this curiosity. It's thinking about, oh, I wonder how that will feel. I wonder what that will feel like or be like. I mean, I think one of the things it does inform why I'm like that is that my mother sadly passed away when I was a teenager. And she was only in her mid-50s. And I just really then thought life is short. And why shouldn't we enjoy it to its maximum? Because who knows what's around the corner? So I think when opportunities, just like you were told by your boss, when opportunities and adventures come along, grab them with both hands, because you never know where they will take you. And it's that curiosity and willingness to give it a go. Many things don't work out, but many things do as well.
Oh, well, that's my next question. Yes. I mean, I've interviewed quite a few entrepreneurs in my time, people who've made millions out of an idea, but they all say to me, don't think this is the first idea I've tried. I have tried so many different things and they have failed. This one has done okay, but don't think it was easy like that. Is it the same for you? I mean, we hear about your successes, but have there been failures along the way?
Oh, absolutely. For example, I was fundraising along with somebody else to do our expedition to the geographical North Pole. And after 1 year of fundraising, we had sponsors who'd given us clothing and equipment and so on. My colleague pulled out of the expedition. And, you know, despite my desire to do it, I knew that there probably wouldn't be somebody that had complementary skills like him very easily to find as an alternative. What do you say to your sponsors? Do you have to hand the money back? Do you have to say, oops, we've made a mistake? And it's at tough moments like that I've realised you just have to put your hands up and say, I'm really sorry, with the best intentions we went forward and it's not going to work out. And to my surprise, that when you're open and honest with people and you tell them the reality and offer, as I say, to give them their money back, then our sponsors were all very supportive. They said, keep the money, keep the clothing, something else will come along. We're just ever so glad you've kept us informed.
And you can as well, does it? It's not just the getting to the North Pole, it's the getting to the starting point that can be a real challenge.
Yeah, and that is one of the biggest challenges is fundraising. I had to raise £15,000 for the Magnetic North Pole expedition, and I spent a long time seeking sponsorship for that, and ultimately got it from one sponsor in the end. But, you know, those challenges are just as difficult and very often unsuccessful. So, you know, not all projects come to fruition.
True. And you've got to be able to cope with that and still go on. I mean, it's interesting you saying that, because already we can hear that you've gone into sort of coaching people, telling people how to live their best lives. I mean, what sort of people come to you? Surely they would already be motivated to that sort of thing when they come to you.
Well, very often I'm working with senior leaders in some of the world's biggest companies worldwide. And you might look at them, yes, and say, absolutely, they're successful. Why would they need coaching? And yet, in these days, the world of business is changing so much. There's so much complexity. There's so much requirements for them to adapt to things like climate change, for engaging their workforce more clearly, all the things that they have to do. Is they want a thinking space, and very often they are requiring to reevaluate their beliefs about what business is and how they operate as a leader. So sitting with somebody and I help them to think through perhaps some of those tough issues that they have to face, not tell them what to do, but just like David, ask them some questions, get them to think and reflect on what's working and what needs to change. And when you get that safe space, just like we had in our tents with our colleagues, and you feel that you can actually be open and honest, that's when the best thinking comes out of those leaders and enables them to change how they lead. And that has a ripple effect across the whole world.
I was just going to ask, are there any moments that you draw on from your Arctic expeditions or whatever, that you'd say, for instance, we were in the tent, we had to survive through 36 hours of, almost sleep deprivation and food deprivation, but we did this and that helped us get through. You obviously do draw on your own personal experiences to help others.
Yeah, absolutely. I often use the phrase, what are the crevasse zones in your organisation? So a little bit like in Greenland, where you can be skiing across and all of a sudden the snow and the ice will just give way beneath your feet and you could plummet hundreds of feet to your death or to some, problem.
Yeah.
There are many crevasse zones in organisations, and I often see the leaders really stop and take a moment to think when I ask them that question. And then I say, well, how are you going to make sure you avoid those crevasse zones? And I'd help your people to identify where they are so that they can take safety measures to avoid them too. So it's using metaphors from the world of adventure and expeditions that really help to inspire leaders to just think about how they could do things differently.
And that's so interesting, because when you just said that, where are your crevasse zones? I bet most people do know they have them, and they probably could identify them, but it's something they've always put to the back of the mind instead of to the front of the mind and dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And people will only deal with it. People will only deal with it, and I think if they feel safe. And that is primarily what I need to do as a coach and a person that's supporting leaders, is to create an environment where they feel safe. Just like David did in the Arctic with us, is when a leader feels safe, then maybe they will say, maybe I do need to look at those crevasse zones one more time, and let's explore them. Because the more we avoid them, the more they will come back and potentially get us in the end.
Yeah. Yes, if you avoid them, they're still there, aren't they? And that, you've written quite a few books on this. As far as I can see, you've written lots of books on this sort of thing. It just shows that people need and want and aspire to the sort of things that you are talking about.
Yeah, well, I think it's back to this ability to adapt, the ability to cope with change. That word risk that you can see on the screen in one of the books that I co-wrote is really a fascinating subject. It's just any of our attitudes and propensity for risk taking. As I say, is it a risk to try something different for breakfast every day? Walk down a different street in your town or village that you've never been down before? You might think they're not risky, but the more we practice them, the more we feel comfortable when we come to a big risk.
Yes, I see. It's a skill that you practice. Tell me about your podcast, because again, this is something that did it sort of just start because of COVID, but it's really been an interesting journey for you.
Well, it started prior to COVID. We've been running it for 18 months now. It's called Access to Inspiration. And it was a little bit like some of those coaching conversations I was having with leaders, and anybody that I was working with for that matter, had the privilege of having on a one-to-one basis. Very often people would be telling me these amazing stories, and I would be thinking, wow, that's so inspiring, and I'm the only person that's getting to hear this. Imagine if I could create the platform to be able to amplify those stories in some way. And we've had some really fascinating people on the podcast. They're not the celebrities, they're not big names, I'm sure, like you would be interviewing, Anne, but what they are people with real life experiences that can be used to inspire others. And I think there's real value in that. And we've been having some great success over the last 18 months.
And are there any particular people who've stood out, or particular stories they've told you that have stood out?
Yeah, I'll give one example. David John Bartow, who's actually a Viking speaker as well. He's a retired astronaut, and he was former research manager at the International Space Station. So I had a chance to have a conversation with him, and I asked him about what inspired him when he was young. And he talked about this element of curiosity as well. And he said around the dinner table with his family, him and his brother used to always be asking lots of questions. And his father always used to say, I don't know the answer, let's get the encyclopedia down and we can look at it together. And then they would discuss as a family what the answer was. And that really inspired him to think about what was possible and want to learn things. Now, when he shared that story in the podcast, then I had feedback from a listener later on who said, I heard that and I was thinking about how I react or how I behave with my 6-year-old daughter. And she's often coming to ask me, Mummy, what's this? What's that? What's the next thing? And prior to that, listening to the podcast, she probably would have just said, oh, go away, I'm too busy. And she thought, maybe I need to have a different approach with my daughter. So she began to take this approach, not getting the encyclopedia out these days, of course, but saying, come on then, let's go, we'll find out this together. And she said it's changed completely her relationship with her daughter about how they change kind of no time into curiosity and thinking about what's possible. And I think if we're a conduit to making that happen, that inspiration that flows onto somebody else can change their life in the future.
Absolutely. And it's lovely when you do, when we do these interviews, when you do your podcasts, when you get feedback from people saying, that's what inspired me, or have you ever thought of this? I've now interviewed 1 or 2 astronauts, but at least 2 or 3 of them have actually said they were inspired by simply being taken to a museum and seeing John Glenn's old spacesuit or something like that. You never know quite what will inspire somebody to what ultimately as an adult they may do. Tell me about Ski for Cancer.
Yeah, well, that's a charity that I'm a patron of, and they're providing some great respite care for people who have had cancer. So again, it's just a small way I can be involved in giving back, and I just always interested to try and work out ways that I can create a ripple effect, make a small difference in other people's lives, I don't have any children, so while other people might measure their value or their legacy through the lives of their children and what they go on to do, I kind of look at it in the kind of global context. In what lives across the world can I influence? Yeah. And then if those ripple effects can have a positive difference in the future, I'll feel that I've made some positive difference in the world too.
You do a lot of public speaking now, of course. You're what they call a motivational speaker. Somebody, you have to have something you were scared of. Did it frighten you at all getting up onto a stage, doing something like that TED Talk, for instance, knowing that you had an audience in front of you, but also a TV audience? Did that not terrify you?
Oh, yes. There's always the heart racing quickly. I think that's a good thing. I always try to imagine that whoever I'm speaking to, whether they're a virtual audience or they're real and live in front of me, that I'm speaking to a bunch of my friends. And that, maybe it's using visualization again, and that technique of imagining it in my mind somehow just relaxes me enough to communicate hopefully effectively. And also I say to myself, well, what's the worst that can happen? What if I get it wrong? People make mistakes. We're human beings. It's not the end of the world. So I think if I can go in and have that a little bit more relaxed attitude with myself, hopefully that will bring out the brilliance for the audience that's listening or watching.
Are you ever able to find out whether or not something you have said or a person you have coached has actually succeeded after your help?
Yes, many times. Well, certainly in the corporate world, measurement is a key part of the whole process. So we're always going in and asking leaders afterwards how it has impacted on how they lead in the bottom dollar numbers or pounds in terms of value to their business. So that is one thing in the corporate world. What I do love is I've had on many occasions an email that's been sent to me or somebody writing me a letter and saying, 10 years ago, I heard you speak and you changed my life. And I therefore wanted to recommend you to a friend of mine, and here she is, or something like that. And it can be years later. And that's why I do think it's like a ripple effect. You never know when you drop this stone in the pond where it's impacting. So I just think you have to just keep going.
And conversely, do you ever have people who say, no, I don't agree with you on that? They are resistant to change, even though they might have sought you out and asking for your help. They are resistant to change.
Yes. Excuse me. I find that is an interesting challenge. And in that situation, I've had 99% of the people I've worked with eventually will find some way of changing. It's often that it's not that they don't want to change, it's they don't want to change right now. And I therefore can, if you enclose a horse, it will rear up and try and escape because it feels threatened. It's in an enclosed space. Human beings, I think, are like that too. If we pin them down and enclose them and say, you have to do it now, they will just create this defense mechanism. So we have to be able to kind of open up and say, okay, now's not the right time. And then just slowly, sometimes do a little bit of drip feed in terms of information or getting them to engage in conversation with somebody else. And then when they want to explore that particular thing, then maybe they will come to the party.
Well, I tell you what,
it's easy though.
No. Well, people aren't easy always, are they? But I know you have a very firm relationship with Viking. And of course, everybody watching at the moment probably can't wait to get onto their next cruise. And of course, Viking have started the idea of adventure cruises as well now. Let's just have a look at this. And then afterwards, I want to ask you whether you think that those of us who want to go in luxury exploring are a bit wussy. Have a look at this.
At the Arctic Cathedral, try to imagine architect Jan Inge Hovig's inspiration for this iconic triangular shape. Or at the Polar Museum, learn about the brave individuals who came before you. Long ago, venturing out into the uncharted, unforgiving Arctic. Then it's off to the Svalbard archipelago, where 60% of the landmass is covered by glaciers. It's one of the Earth's most unique ecosystems, and your purpose-built Viking vessel is an ideal base from which to explore and learn. A floating classroom where you'll come to understand the science behind the rugged, glacier-carved landscapes and the remarkable wildlife that somehow create a life here. Your nature-based adventure is not bound by a rigid schedule. as you explore these pristine waters. With Viking, each day is thoughtfully optimized to maximize weather and wildlife viewing opportunities. The possibilities are nearly endless because in untamed Svalbard, marine mammals and seabirds far outnumber the human population. On the water, watch in wonder. You might spot walruses basking in the sun, or the white whales, the belugas, as they busily feed amid the ever-changing sea ice. On land, you'll step where possibly no one has before, stopping to study the flora and fauna and searching for elusive wildlife, such as the clever Arctic fox, or the restless Svalbard reindeer, the timeless nomads of the north. You may even catch a glimpse of the Arctic's most legendary inhabitant, the formidable polar bear.
Now, Sue, exploring in luxury, is that something you would ever be interested in? What do you think of us, those of us that want to do it that way?
I'll put my hand up for that, yeah. It looks amazing. Those ships look absolutely wonderful. What's not to like about luxury? You know, we don't have to be roughing it all the time. I think if people get a chance to experience these remote parts of the world, even on a wonderful luxury ship like we're seeing there, what's not to like about that?
It just, again, opens you up to the wonders of the world. And as you were saying earlier, life is too short anyway. So the more experiences you can pack in. But that really does look amazing, doesn't it?
It does.
Given that you are an explorer and you want to get out and about and see the world, what's the last year been like for you?
Well, it's certainly been a virtual life as opposed to an outdoor life too much. Although I do live in the countryside in England, so I'm able to get out and walk locally in our small village here and not see too many people, which is wonderful. But most of my work these days is virtual. Most of the clients I work with aren't in the UK, they're overseas, and I'm probably never going to meet them face to face anyway. So yeah, it just gets spending more time in front of a screen is the norm these days, isn't it?
It is. So you've managed to get through. But given that things are opening up, have you got another expedition planned?
Well, I'm on a Viking ship, on a cruise. Does that?
We got the hint. But no, I mean, to anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
Where's the first country you'd like to go to now?
I never have really a sort of bucket list or anywhere that's particularly on my list of places to visit. I think, if anything, it's more about opportunities to go and visit friends, and it just happens to be in particular countries where they're located. So I think what I am missing is that relationship element of catching up with good friends, many of whom are sadly located in other parts of the world. So it will be a flight to perhaps the USA or some other parts of the world, down to Australia, New Zealand, when time permits and when those countries begin to open up again, to see some friends in those places.
It's going to take a while, I think, to get to certain countries, isn't it? Right, we've got some questions from viewers. Tony from London. How did you decide to do motivational speaking? Does that mean giving up doing your own expeditions?
No, it doesn't, Tony. I still do expeditions. In fact, 2017, I was in Greenland skiing with some Inuit hunters and going out with them and understanding their lifestyle. So it just means I balance my life in a little bit of work and a little bit of pleasure. So if I can inspire people to have their own adventures, that's very satisfying for me too.
Alice from somewhere in the US says, has there ever been a moment when you have turned back or given up?
There's a good question. I haven't turned back on any expeditions. And to be fair, I can't think of times where I have chosen to give up. I think the example I gave earlier, Alice, around the North Pole expedition where my colleague dropped out meant that we had to give up, would be one way of doing that. But sadly, I do tend to stick in and get things, see them right through to the end if I can.
Yeah, well, that's what it's all about with you, clearly, isn't it? Max from Stockholm says, oh, this is a good one. Where in the world would you never go?
Well, I think a very hot desert might not suit me. So maybe I know in Australia, there's a desert in the middle of Australia. I think that would maybe not be comfortable for me. And certainly increasing temperatures in many parts of the world these days, those 40 and 50 degrees. Although I prefer the cold because I'm normally quite a hot person temperature-wise, so I wouldn't like to go to too hot a part of the world.
Samantha, yeah, I see. Samantha in Dorset says, I have 3 sisters and there's tremendous rivalry between us. Do you have siblings? Because you must be the ultimate nightmare in sibling rivalry.
Great question. I have a sister and she is completely the opposite to me. So we actually don't compete on trying to do expeditions and adventures. She has some fantastic strengths in creativity, in decorating wonderful cakes, in homemaking. She has brought up 2 wonderful children. So she is completely the opposite to me, as I say, and I really admire that difference that we have rather than trying to compete for the same things.
Is she younger than you?
She's older than me, so she's
so that's a reaction to all your expeditions. She just was her own person to start with.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yes.
Oh, that's lovely. Look, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you today. And I know everybody watching at the moment will probably bump into you on a Viking ship as well quite soon, somewhere beautiful, and where they'll be able to hear you give your live talk as well. But for the moment, Sue, thank you so much for joining us here on Viking TV. It's been great.
I've really enjoyed talking to you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to push the boat out and try something different for breakfast tomorrow morning.
Good
Just
for you.
to push myself that little bit. That's exciting, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So thanks very much to everybody. And next week, I'm going to be meeting the couple who found Britain's best ever Jurassic fossil find by using, would you believe, Google Maps and Google Earth. They're an extraordinary couple called Neville and Sally Hollingworth, and they'll be able to tell us how on earth they did that, literally how on Google Earth they did it. Until then, very goodbye and keep safe.